The house was as quiet as the night outside. Clara sat on the couch, her eyes glued to the baby monitor screen, while Theo slept soundly. The weeks since his birth had been exhausting, and the monitor had become an indispensable ally. She sighed, running her fingers through her messy hair. Her husband still wasn't home from work, as usual, leaving her with the company of the TV and the white noise from the monitor. The routine had become second nature. Waiting for Theo to wake up for his next feeding, checking the monitor every so often, and battling the relentless fatigue that seemed to settle in. That's when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound came through the baby monitor. Clara frowned and leaned in, squinting as if that would help her hear better. It's probably just static, she thought, but something about it felt off. It didn't sound mechanical, it was more human. She turned up the monitor's volume. For a moment, Theo's room seemed wrapped in complete silence, interrupted only by the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then the sound came again, soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. Clara, her heart raced. The voice was clear, but it couldn't be real. She shot up, her breath uneven. With hurried steps, she climbed the stairs to Theo's room. The door was slightly ajar and the room, bathed in a gentle nightlight glow, looked untouched. Theo lay peacefully in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Clara inspected the monitor, her eyes fixed on the camera positioned in the corner of the room. There was no one there, yet a cold shiver ran down her spine. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the growing panic. "I'm just imagining things," she whispered to herself. She turned off the monitor and stood there for a moment, watching Theo. Everything seemed normal, but that night, Clara couldn't sleep. The sound of that voice echoed in her mind like a silent warning. The days that followed brought an uneasy calm. During the day, Clara worked hard to dismiss the incident, convincing herself it was nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on her. But at night, the tension crept back in. On the third night, the whispers grew louder. Clara was in the kitchen, washing dishes when she heard it again. "Clara!" This time, the voice sounded closer, more real. Dropping the dishes, she ran to the monitor. "Who's there?" she asked aloud, feeling foolish the moment the words left her mouth. No answer came, just a silence heavy with something unseen. Suddenly, the screen flickered. For a split second, Clara saw something, a shadow moving across Theo's room. She dropped the monitor and sprinted upstairs, her hands trembling as she flung the door open. The room was empty. Theo was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the fear gripping his mother. Clara tried to convince herself it was all just a mix of exhaustion, paranoia, and a faulty device. But deep down, an unsettling feeling told her otherwise. When she returned to the living room, the house felt different. Maybe it was a silence, now heavier, or the sudden chill that seemed to creep in out of nowhere. Clara knew, from that moment on, things wouldn't be the same. The following days became a battle between reason and fear. Clara began carrying the baby monitor everywhere, as if it were an extension of herself, even though every glance at the screen brought a wave of anxiety and unease. She avoided telling her husband about what was happening, afraid of sounding irrational. He already seemed distant since Theo's birth. It was on an unusually quiet afternoon that normalcy started to unravel completely. Clara was folding clothes in the bedroom when she heard static coming from the baby monitor, which she'd left on the crib. She froze, her heart pounding. This time, it wasn't just a faint, indistinct voice. It was a soft, whistled melody, familiar, yet deeply unsettling. A lullaby. Theo, lying in his crib, stared at something beyond the ceiling. His usually bright, curious eyes were glazed over, and a small smile curled on his lips. Clara's stomach turned. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice shaky as she slowly approached the crib. The sound stopped abruptly. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt suffocating. When she picked Theo up, Clara noticed he was trembling slightly, even though the room was warm. The unease lingered through the night. Clara decided to have Theo sleep in their bedroom, but she left the baby monitor in his old room, hoping to catch some clue about what was happening. Around 2 a.m., the sound returned. Clara, who had been dozing off on the living room couch, woke up with a start as a voice came through the monitor. "Clara, listen to me." Her blood ran cold. The voice was deep, masculine, but it had a distorted quality, as though it came from something far too distant to be human. Without thinking, she grabbed the monitor, shaking it as she shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice responded, slow and deliberate, "Protect Theo." The monitor shut off on its own, and the house plunged into complete darkness as the lights flickered and went out. Clara's terror shifted into action, holding Theo tightly. She tried calling her husband, but the calls wouldn't go through. As she glanced around the room, something caught her eye. The TV screen flickered to life, showing static that slowly formed the outline of a figure hovering in the corner of the room. Her eyes couldn't quite focus on it, but the air grew heavy, as though an unseen force was filling the space. By morning, Clara resolved to take Theo to her mother's house, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating sense of danger. However, just as she strapped Theo into his car seat, she noticed something chilling. The baby monitor, left behind in the living room, had turned itself back on. Its screen displayed a message that froze her in place. "You can't run." The simple, haunting words etched themselves into her mind as she drove away. Something was connected to her, to the house, or to the monitor. Something that seemed to know more than she could fathom. At her mother's house, Clara found temporary solace in being away from her home. But the fear lingered, refusing to let her rest. Theo was unusually fussy, crying more than usual as if he too sensed the wrongness that clung to them. The next morning, while her mother made coffee, Clara decided she couldn't just sit idle anymore. Opening her laptop, she began digging for answers. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find, but the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the house couldn't be ignored. Her initial search turned up nothing. A regular suburban house built in the 1970s, renovated several times over the years. But when Clara widened her search to include incidents in the neighborhood, an old article caught her eye. The title, faded and almost forgotten by time, read, "Family disappears under mysterious circumstances." Clara's heart pounded as she read. The article described how, 30 years ago, a man named David Schaefer, his wife, and their young daughter had lived in the same house. David worked nights, and his wife had confided to friends about hearing strange voices on the baby monitor before the family vanished without a trace. The investigation had turned up no leads, leaving the case unsolved. A photo of the man accompanied the article. Clara's breath hitched as recognition dawned on her. The deep, resonant tone of the voice she'd heard through the monitor seemed to echo in her mind. Driven by an impulse, Clara searched for more information about David Schaefer. His name was tied to grim rumors. Neighbors described him as odd and reclusive, a man who distrusted everyone around him. Some theories claimed he had snapped and murdered his family before vanishing. Others suggested something darker was at play, something that had never made it into police records. Clara slammed the laptop shut, her breathing quick and shallow. The connection between the stories was undeniable. The house she now called home seemed burdened by an unseen weight, and the baby monitor might have been the medium through which the sinister past was surfacing. Before returning home, Clara made one last attempt to make sense of what was happening. She turned to an online forum for paranormal discussions and posted an anonymous account of the events surrounding the baby monitor. She didn't expect quick responses, but within minutes, replies began pouring in. One message stood out. "The baby monitor is only the beginning. Be careful of what might come through it." A chill ran down Clara's spine. She didn't fully understand what it meant, but the suggestion that something more physical or dangerous could manifest left her frozen. That night, against her better judgment, Clara decided to return home with Theo. She needed answers, and running away felt like merely delaying the inevitable. As she opened the front door, the air inside was colder than it should have been. Everything seemed in its place, but an eerie energy hung heavy, as though the house had been waiting for her. After settling Theo in his crib, she turned on the baby monitor. The screen flickered immediately. This time, there was no static. The camera displayed the nursery with perfect clarity, but something was off. In the corner of the room, a shadow loomed. Clara froze, realizing it wasn't just a smudge or a trick of light. It was a tall figure, unmoving but undeniably present. And then, for the first time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was a direct command. "Leave." Clara stepped back, her eyes glued to the monitor. The shadowy figure remained still, its presence suffocating, as though it were waiting. The voice came again, firmer this time, yet still laced with an unnatural tone. "Leave. Before it's too late." She knew she had to act, but fear rooted her in place. When she finally found the strength to rush to Theo's room, her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She pushed the bedroom door open, bracing herself for something horrifying, but the room was empty. The corner where the figure had appeared on the monitor looked ordinary, yet the oppressive atmosphere lingered, as if the presence was merely hiding, watching. Theo was awake, babbling as though nothing had happened. Clara scooped him up and rushed out of the room without a backward glance. Back in the living room, clutching Theo tightly, she tried calling her husband again, but the call still wouldn't go through. As she contemplated her next move, the monitor crackled back to life. This time, it wasn't whispers or commands. It was a low, distorted laugh that seemed to reverberate through the entire house. "You can't run, Clara." She yanked the monitor's plug and threw it across the room, but the voice didn't stop. Now it seemed to emanate directly from the walls. The laughter morphed into clearer, more chilling words. "You should have left while you had the chance." Panicking, Clara grabbed Theo and ran for the front door. As she turned the knob, she felt an invisible force shove her backward. The door wouldn't budge. The entire house seemed alive, working against her. Turning around, she saw the TV in the living room flicker on by itself. Static filled the screen, but an image began to emerge. It was Theo's nursery, captured as if by a hidden camera. Something was wrong. In the crib, where Theo should have been, sat another child, a disheveled little girl with tangled hair, staring directly at Clara through the screen. "He's in danger because of you," the male voice said. "Do what must be done, or he'll be mine." Tears streamed down Clara's face as terror consumed her. She screamed, "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" The response came swiftly, cryptic yet resolute. "Protect Theo. Break the cycle." The monitor went dead, and the house fell into a suffocating silence. Clara collapsed onto the couch, clutching Theo as if her life depended on it. What did break the cycle mean? How could she protect Theo from something she couldn't even comprehend? Then she remembered what she had read about David Schaefer. If he and his family had truly vanished, perhaps there was a connection she hadn't pieced together yet. Some reason why the voice was fixated on Theo. Resolute, Clara realized there was only one way to find out. She needed to return to Theo's room and confront whatever was lurking there. But first, she needed help. Clara's decision felt insane even to herself. But something told her that running away wasn't an option. The entity haunting the house was tied to the place and to the monitor, but it also seemed to know something she didn't yet understand. If there was any chance of protecting Theo, it would mean facing whatever was lurking in his room. Before heading upstairs, Clara searched for help online again, posting a detailed account on a paranormal forum. This time, she mentioned David Schaefer's name and the cycle of disappearances. Within minutes, responses began to flood in, but one message stood out among the deluge of comments. "You need a link. something that connects you to the spirit. But be careful. It can either weaken it or make it stronger. With no further explanation, the message left her with more questions than answers, but she knew what she had to do. Slowly, she climbed the stairs, each creaking step sounding like a grim warning. When she reached Theo's bedroom door, she paused. The same oppressive feeling was there, stronger than before, as if something was waiting on the other side. Clara opened the door slowly. The room looked normal, except for the baby monitor on the crib, which had turned itself back on. The screen showed static, but the same shadowy silhouette was in the corner of the room. "I'm here. What do you want from me?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but steady. The static stopped, and for the first time, a figure began to take shape on the screen. It was David Schaefer. His expression was tormented, his eyes filled with a fury that seemed to burn beyond the physical world. "You don't understand." The voice was low but clear, coming directly from the monitor. "They'll keep going. They'll always keep going." Clara stepped closer, still holding Theo, her heart pounding wildly. "Who'll keep going? What do you mean?" David tilted his head as if listening to something Clara couldn't hear. "The cycle must be broken. They take the youngest. First, it was my daughter. Now, they want Theo. How do I stop this?" Clara shouted, her frustration and fear spilling over. David's figure began to dissolve on the screen, but before disappearing completely, he left one final message. "There's an object, something that belongs to them. Destroy it and the cycle ends." As soon as he vanished, the monitor turned off on its own, leaving Clara alone in the stifling silence of the room. An object, she thought. But what could it be? Clara began searching the room, but nothing seemed out of place. After several minutes of frantic searching, she noticed something odd on the wall near the crib. A small section of wallpaper was slightly peeling, as if something were hidden behind it. Carefully, she pulled the wallpaper back, revealing a small opening in the wall. Inside was an old wooden box, covered in symbols she didn't recognize. When she opened it, a chill ran down her spine. Inside was a small metal pendant shaped like an eye, tarnished and darkened with age. The moment she touched the pendant, a cold shiver coursed through her body, and the house seemed to tremble slightly, as if something had been awakened. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and the voice echoed again, louder and more urgent this time. "Destroy it now." Clara knew she had to act quickly. With Theo crying in her arms, she raced to the kitchen, grabbed the heaviest hammer she could find, and placed the pendant on the counter. But before she could strike, she heard heavy footsteps behind her, followed by a chilling, inhuman laugh. Something was there with her. "You shouldn't have found that," the voice said, seething with supernatural rage. Clara turned, but no one was there, only a shadow, growing on the kitchen wall, taking the shape of something monstrous. Summoning all the strength she had, Clara raised a hammer and brought it down on the pendant with all her might. The impact created an ear-splitting sound, like a scream echoing from countless places at once. The shadow slowly dissolved, and the house fell into complete silence. But as Clara tried to catch her breath, a deep instinct told her this wasn't over. The house remained still, but Clara knew this was only the prelude to something greater. The pendant lay shattered on the counter, its fragments faintly vibrating as if still charged with residual energy. Theo had stopped crying, but Clara could feel the lingering danger. Hammer still in hand, she began to move cautiously through the house, checking each room. The air felt heavier with every step, and the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally in the dim light. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, closer than ever. "This isn't enough, Clara. You must finish it." She spun around, her eyes scanning the space around her, but there was no one there. Only the sound of her own ragged breathing filled the air. "What do you mean, finish it?" she screamed, desperation evident in her voice. The answer came not as words, but as a deafening scream that reverberated through the walls. Objects tumbled off shelves, The floor shook beneath her feet, and a massive shadow began to form in the living room, taking on a grotesque and undefined shape. Clara knew she had to protect Theo. Clutching him tightly, she ran upstairs and locked herself in the bedroom. But the sense of safety was fleeting. The shadow seemed to move through the house, drawing closer with every second, like a swelling tide of darkness. Then she realized the pendant's fragments were still downstairs. Perhaps destroying it partially had only weakened the entity, but hadn't eliminated it completely. The voice returned, this time echoing inside her mind. Complete the cycle. Get rid of it all. Clara looked at Theo, who stared back at her with wide, calm eyes. There was an eerie wisdom in his gaze, as if he understood what was at stake. She knew she couldn't hesitate any longer. With renewed determination, Clara placed Theo in his crib and grabbed the baby monitor. She climbed up to the attic, where she knew there was an old and used fireplace. There, she found what seemed like the perfect place to end it all. Gathering the fragments of the pendant, she wrapped them in an old cloth and lit a small flame with matches she found nearby. As the fire began to consume the remnants, the house reacted violently. A piercing scream filled the space, as if the entity were being torn from its very existence. Clara watched as the shadows in the attic recoiled, slowly disintegrating until there was nothing left but silence. When the final fragment was consumed by the flames, the oppressive feeling lifted. For the first time in days, the house felt light, as if it had been cleansed. Clara descended the stairs slowly and found Theo sleeping soundly in his crib. The baby monitor was off, lifeless. Overwhelmed by exhaustion, she dropped to her knees beside the crib, tears streaming down her face. She had won, but she knew the emotional scars of what she had endured would stay with her forever. When she finally found the strength to stand, a faint sound came from the hallway. Her heart stopped for a moment, but it was just the wind, slipping through a slightly open window. Clara looked at Theo and smiled, knowing that despite everything, he was safe. For now, the days that followed were strangely peaceful. The house, once weighed down by an oppressive energy, now felt like an ordinary home. Clara felt almost relieved, as though a tremendous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Theo, too, seemed calmer, smiling and babbling with a joy she hadn't seen in weeks. She decided to use this moment of calm to reorganize the house. She cleaned up the debris left from her battle with the entity, discarded the baby monitor, and began redecorating Theo's room, even removing the wallpaper that had hidden the dark secret. As she painted the walls with a soft and cheerful color, she heard the doorbell ring. Oddly enough, she wasn't expecting anyone. With Theo asleep, she went downstairs and opened the door, finding a man who appeared to be around 50 years old. His expression was serious but kind. "Clara?" he asked, holding an envelope in his hands. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" "My name is Paul Schaefer. David Schaefer was my brother," he said, his voice heavy, as though each word carried a great burden. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Do you know what happened here?" Paul nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know more than I'd like. May I come in?" Clara hesitated for a moment, but there was something about the man's seriousness that convinced her he wasn't a threat. She gestured for him to enter and led him to the living room. As they sat down, Paul began recounting his family's story. He explained that David had been an ordinary man until something inexplicable began happening in the house. His daughter, Emily, started hearing voices and displaying strange behaviors. David became obsessed with protecting her, but no one believed him. When they disappeared, "I became obsessed with finding answers," Paul said, placing the envelope on the table. "I researched everything about the house and the symbols you found. I don't know why this happened again, but I suspect something is still trapped here." Clara felt a chill run through her. "I destroyed the pendant, burned everything. The entity is gone." Paul shook his head, deep in thought. "Maybe you broke the physical connection, but these things have ways of lingering." He opened the envelope, revealing old photos and pages from a diary. One of the photos showed David holding Emily in his arms, smiling, but what caught Clara's attention was the background of the image. In the corner of the room, barely visible, was a shadow she recognized instantly. "That's what you face, isn't it?" Paul asked, pointing to the figure in the photo. Clara nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, but I thought it was over." Paul sighed deeply. "Maybe not entirely. These things, they have ways of clinging to people. You need to make sure there's nothing left. No object, no fragment, not even a memory." His words hit her like a punch. Something inside her whispered that there was still a loose end, something she hadn't noticed. "Is Theo safe now?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. Paul looked at her with grave seriousness. "If the entity was truly destroyed, then yes. But if anything remains, you'll have to be ready to face it again." Clara swallowed hard. She thought the battle was over, but maybe it had only just begun. When Paul left, he handed the envelope to Clara, saying the diary might hold clues to ensure nothing was left behind. That night, while Theo slept, Clara read every word of the diary. Among the entries, she found something that chilled her to the bone, a detailed description of how the entity tried to infiltrate the dreams of those who fought against it. And then as she read, she heard the sound she thought she'd never hear again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Clara?" She turned, but the baby monitor was no longer there. The voice seemed to come from within the house, like a living memory that refused to fade. Clara stood frozen, the whisper echoing in her ears like a lingering ghost. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, that exhaustion and trauma were playing tricks on her mind. But the truth was undeniable. Something was still there. Grabbing Theo in her arms, she ran to the living room, turned on every light, and tried to focus. Yet the sounds persisted, low and steady, like a call coming from every corner of the house. Clara opened the envelope Paul had left and began poring over the photos and diary once more. She felt there was something there, something she hadn't fully understood yet. One specific diary entry caught her attention. The entity is not just a spirit. It's a cycle that feeds on fears, regrets, and familial bonds. Destroying it physically isn't enough. You must confront what it represents. Clara read those words over and over, trying to grasp their meaning. What did it mean to confront something so abstract? As she pondered, a sound startled her. It was Theo's cry, except he wasn't in her arms. She looked down. Theo was quiet, sleeping peacefully, but the crying continued, coming from upstairs. Clara felt her heart stop. With no other choice, she climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like an insurmountable challenge. The sound led her back to Theo's room, but when she entered, the crib was empty. "This isn't real. This isn't real," she whispered to herself, trying to cling to sanity. The male voice spoke again, but this time, it was laced with an emotion she hadn't heard before: desperation. "You need to choose, Clara." She turned toward the voice and saw something that made her stomach churn. In the corner of the room, the shadow had returned, but this time, it wasn't just a silhouette. It was a figure, amorphous and shifting, as if the darkness were struggling to form a human face. "Choose what?" Clara cried, hot tears streaming down her cheeks. The voice responded, each word heavy with a gravity that seemed to crush her. "The cycle feeds on fear and loss. If you don't confront it, Theo will be mine." Clara fell to her knees, clutching her head in her hands. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to fight, but how could she battle something she barely understood? Then, a passage from David Schaefer's diary surfaced in her memory. It spoke of the need to face the entity directly, to confront her deepest fears. Clara knew what she had to do, even though the thought terrified her. With renewed determination, she stood and stared directly at the shadow. "I won't run," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "If you want to destroy me, then come. But leave my son alone." The entity hesitated for a moment, as if it were assessing her resolve. Then the room changed. The walls began to dissolve, and Clara was engulfed by complete darkness. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in her home. She was in a strange place, a space that seemed to be made up of distorted memories. She recognized fragments of her childhood, moments of loss, and even glimpses of her tumultuous relationship with her husband. The entity was there, waiting. This time, it had a form, a face that vaguely resembled her own, but with empty eyes and a cruel expression. "You feed on my fear," Clara said, her voice trembling. "But I'm not giving you that anymore." The figure moved toward her, and Clara felt a wave of terror trying to overwhelm her. But instead of giving in, she focused on Theo, his laughter, his smile. "You can't control me, and you will never have my son." With those words, the world around her began to crumble. The entity screamed, its form slowly disintegrating. Clara felt the ground vanish beneath her feet, and in the blink of an eye, she was back in Theo's room. The baby was in his crib, sleeping peacefully. The house was silent once more. Clara knew she had won, but she also knew it had changed her forever. The entity was destroyed, but the scars would remain. Holding Theo safely in her arms, she whispered, "You'll never be in danger again, my love. Never again." The days that followed were marked by a tense peace. Clara felt she had won the battle against the entity, but the emotional toll ran deep. Still, even with the apparent calm, something felt unsettling, as if an invisible shadow still lingered over the house. One particularly quiet night, Clara woke up suddenly, struck by the strange sensation of being watched. She looked around and saw Theo sleeping soundly in his crib beside the bed. Everything seemed normal, but her maternal instinct said otherwise. That was when she noticed. The baby monitor, the one she had destroyed, was back, sitting on the dresser, completely intact, with its green light blinking as if it were functioning. Clara froze. Terror gripped her body as she tried to process the impossible. Slowly, she got up, moving toward the monitor with trembling hands. When she looked at the screen, the image she saw left her breathless. It wasn't Theo's room. It was somewhere else, a dark, empty space with a single rocking chair in the center. Sitting in the chair was a motionless figure. The faint light barely revealed his face, but Clara knew who it was. David Schaefer. His voice echoed through the room, coming from the monitor with a disturbingly clear tone. "You thought this was over? It's not." A chill ran down Clara's spine. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. David leaned slightly forward, his eyes locked on the camera as if he were looking directly at her. "The cycle isn't broken with words. There's a choice you need to make. An exchange." Clara froze. "What exchange?" David hesitated for a moment, as if he were struggling against something. When he spoke again, his voice sounded more human, filled with sorrow. "I was weak. I couldn't protect my family. But you still have a chance." The lights in the room began to flicker, and the monitor shut off. Before Clara could react, the rocking chair started creaking on its own, moving slowly in the corner of the room. The voice returned, but this time it wasn't David's. It was the entity's, deep, distorted, and dripping with malice. "Love comes with a price. Choose. You or Theo." Tears streamed down Clara's face. The thought of sacrificing herself for Theo's safety seemed obvious, but something in the entity's voice made her hesitate. This was a game, a trap. "I'm not playing your game," Clara shouted, anger rising above her fear. "If you want to end this, you'll have to face me directly." The house shook as if an earthquake had struck. The rocking chair toppled over, and the shadows began to shift and solidify again, this time forming the silhouette of something monstrous, something beyond human comprehension. Clara placed herself between Theo and the entity, raising her arms in a protective stance. "You're not taking him." The entity surged forward, and the room was consumed by absolute darkness. Clara felt the cold and the weight of its presence pressing in around her, but at the same time, something inside her began to shine, a memory. It was the day she held Theo for the first time in the hospital, feeling a love so pure and unconditional that no darkness could ever erase it. The entity paused, as if it were being repelled by the strength of that feeling. Clara realized that this was her weapon. "You can't stand against this," she said, her voice steady. "My love for him is stronger than any fear you try to use against me." The light began to grow around Clara, radiating from within her. The entity screamed, a sharp and distorted sound, as its form slowly disintegrated. When the light finally engulfed everything, Clara collapsed to the floor, exhausted. The house was silent once more. She stood up and went to Theo, who was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the battle that had just taken place. Clara knew she had won, but she also knew that this victory came from her inner strength. The cycle had been broken, and Theo was safe. Finally, she picked up the baby monitor and destroyed it again, making sure no trace of the dark connection remained. With Theo in her arms, she whispered, "It's over. It's finally over." The weeks that followed brought a surreal calm, and Clara began to believe that it was truly over. The house felt brighter, lighter, as if the oppressive weight had finally been lifted. Theo grew healthy and happy, and Clara worked hard to put the traumatic events behind her. She didn't speak about what had happened to anyone, not even to Paul, who had promised to help if anything happened again. Yet, his presence lingered in her mind. There was more to David Schaefer's story than she knew. One day, while reorganizing Theo's belongings, she found David's diary, which Paul had left with her. Despite hesitating, she felt compelled to read the words of a man who had lost everything once more. There was a page she hadn't noticed before, tucked between the last few sheets. It was a letter, apparently written to someone specific. To whoever inherits this burden, the cycle only ends when the bond is completely severed. It's not the objects that bind us to them, but what we leave behind. Love is powerful, but so is regret. Make sure no fragments of doubt or fear remain. Only then will you be truly free. Clara reread those words, a chill running down her spine. Had she missed something? That night, after putting Theo to sleep, Clara felt an unusual restlessness. The house was silent, but there was something in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She decided to check Theo's room, more to reassure herself than for any real reason. When she opened the door, she froze in place. The crib was empty. Her heart raced as she searched the room, looking in every corner. She called out for Theo, but there was no response. The baby monitor, which she had destroyed several times, was there again, its light blinking just like before. On the screen was an image that seemed impossible. Theo was sitting in the same dark place where David Schaefer had appeared. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A shadowy figure was holding the baby, an indistinct silhouette that seemed made of pure darkness. The voice echoed again, calm, almost triumphant. "You made your choice, Clara, but he's still mine." Terror and fury surged within her. Grabbing David's diary and the monitor, Clara ran to the attic, the place where she had destroyed the pendant before. She remembered the words from the letter. "Make sure no fragments of doubt or fear remain." "I have no doubts, and I'm not afraid of you," she yelled, her voice reverberating through the space. The monitor began to hiss, and the figure on the screen spoke again. "If that's true, then prove it." With all her strength, Clara smashed the monitor against the floor, crushing the remnants with a hammer. She grabbed the diary and burned it, watching David's words consumed by the flames. As the fire grew, Clara felt something release inside her, an energy that wasn't just her own but something ancient, as if the house itself was thanking her for her bravery. The figure vanished, and Theo's room returned to normal. He was there, sleeping peacefully, as if nothing had happened. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhausted but finally at peace. She knew, deep in her heart, that the cycle had been completely broken. Months later, Clara decided to move with Theo to a new house, far from any memories of the past events. In the new neighborhood, She found the tranquility she had been searching for. One night, as she was putting Theo to sleep, Clara looked at him and whispered, "We're free now, my love. Forever." The baby smiled in response, and for the first time, Clara felt that those words were truly true.